It's December 10th, 2008. Two brothers, Mark and Andrew Madoff, sit across from their father in his Manhattan penthouse apartment. They've just asked him a question he can't answer. A question about money, about bonuses, about how the numbers on the page simply don't add up. And their father, one of the most respected men on Wall Street, a man who once chaired the NASDAQ stock exchange, a man whose name alone opened every door in New York City, looks at his sons and tells them everything. That his investment fund, the one managing billions of dollars for thousands of clients, is not real. That it never was. That it is, in his own words, basically a giant Ponzi scheme. The next morning, his sons do something their father never expected. They call the FBI. And just like that, 60 years of secrets, 6 decades of fraud, and somewhere between $50 and $65 billion in stolen wealth begins to collapse. True crime documentary fans, this is just the beginning. Like, share, and subscribe to follow every twist and turn in history's most unbelievable cases. To understand how Bernard Lawrence Madoff pulled off the most audacious financial crime in history, you have to understand who he was before the arrest. Because the terrifying truth is, Bernie Madoff wasn't some shadowy villain operating in a back alley. He was your neighbor. He was your friend. He was the guy everyone wanted to trust. Bernie was born on April 29, 1938, in Queens, New York. A working-class kid from Laurelton, a largely Jewish neighborhood in the outer boroughs. He wasn't born into wealth. He wasn't handed anything. He put himself through Hofstra University, graduated with a degree in political science in 1960, and briefly attended Brooklyn Law School before deciding Wall Street, not a courtroom, was where he wanted to make his mark. He was 22 years old when he started Bernard L. Madoff Investment Securities. He seeded the company with $5,000, money he'd earned working summer jobs as a lifeguard and a sprinkler installer. $5,000. That's what it started with. His early role was as a market maker, essentially a middleman who helped buyers and sellers complete trades in the stock market. It wasn't glamorous, but it worked. And Bernie, from the very beginning, had an instinct for this world that most people simply didn't. By the late 1960s, he and his brother Peter had developed some of the earliest computer-based trading systems on Wall Street, technology so ahead of its time that it would eventually become the foundation of the NASDAQ exchange. In fact, Bernie Madoff served as chairman of NASDAQ in 1990, 1991, and again in 1993. Let that sink in for a moment. The man who was secretly running the largest Ponzi scheme in history was simultaneously helping regulate the American stock market. But there was always a shadow side, a second business, a secret life running parallel to the legitimate one. And that second life is where our story really begins. The year is 1960. The same year Bernie founds his legitimate brokerage firm, he also quietly begins offering investment advisory services on the side. He takes clients' money. He promises returns. He invests for them. But here's the problem. He never registers this advisory business with the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, the federal watchdog of the American financial markets. Technically, what he's doing is illegal from day one. For a while, it works fine. The markets are good. Clients are happy. But then, 1962. The stock market takes a serious downturn. Accounts take losses. And Bernie, unwilling to admit failure and desperate to protect his reputation, does something that will define the next 6 decades of his life. He covers the losses using borrowed money, and he never tells his clients what happened. His clients see that their accounts didn't take the hit everyone else did. And instead of becoming suspicious, they become believers. They trust him more. They invest more. He's crossed a line he can never uncross. The years pass. The 1970s arrive, and Bernie leans hard into early computer technology. His firm becomes one of the fastest, most efficient trading operations in the country. The legitimate side of his business is genuinely thriving, making him wealthy, influential, connected. He's friends with hedge fund managers. He rubs elbows with regulators. He cultivates an air of exclusivity around his investment fund. People don't just hand Bernie Madoff their money. They beg to get in. Being a Madoff investor wasn't just a financial decision. It was a status symbol. And Bernie knew exactly how to use that. He cultivated wealthy connections in New York City and Palm Beach, Florida, particularly within Jewish social circles, country clubs, and charitable organizations. He was charming. He was brilliant. He was one of them. Investigators would later describe it as a classic affinity fraud, using shared identity and community trust to lower people's defenses. By the time the 1990s arrived, clients weren't just wealthy individuals. Universities, non-profit foundations, pension funds holding the retirement savings of thousands of ordinary working people. All of them were giving money to Bernie Madoff. And according to Madoff himself, in a court filing in his own words, he never once made a legitimate investment with their money during this period. Not once. Instead, every dollar deposited went straight into a single Chase Manhattan bank account. And the returns he reported? The trading statements showing steady, reliable gains? Complete fabrications. Here's how the fabrication worked. Staff in Madoff's secret operation, run from a separate, hidden floor in his Manhattan offices, the 17th floor of the Lipstick Building, would comb through old editions of the Wall Street Journal and other financial newspapers. They'd identify the stocks that had performed best in the previous month. Then they'd generate backdated transaction records, fake trades that showed Madoff had purchased those stocks just before they went up. In other words, he was always picking winners, because he was picking them after the race was already over. Every month, investors received paper statements, archaic, old-fashioned printouts that didn't match the formatting of any legitimate brokerage, showing consistent, impressive returns. 10 to 15% annually, year after year, in up markets and down markets alike, rain or shine. And nobody questioned it. Because who questions a good thing? Not everyone was fooled. His name is Harry Markopolos, and in 1999, a colleague asked him to reverse engineer Madoff's investment strategy to figure out how he was achieving such consistent, remarkable returns. It took Markopolos about 5 minutes. He looked at the numbers and said flatly, "This is a Ponzi scheme." His reasoning was simple and devastating. Whether the market went up or down, Bernie Madoff produced steady returns of roughly 1% per month. But mathematically, statistically, that is impossible. Markets are volatile. No legitimate strategy produces results that smooth, that consistent, that perfect. Markopolos later compared it to a baseball player batting .966 for an entire season, while everyone else's best hitters are hitting .300 to .400, and nobody suspects a cheat. In May 2000, Markopolos submitted a formal complaint to the SEC. He titled his analysis, "The World's Largest Hedge Fund is a Fraud." The SEC did not take action. He submitted again in 2001, again in 2005, with even more detailed mathematical proof. The SEC interviewed Madoff directly. Madoff later admitted he lied to their faces during that interview. The SEC found, quote, "no evidence of fraud." Over a period of roughly 8 years, the SEC audited Madoff's operation 5 separate times. He passed every single audit. In part, This was because Bernie had hired staff to generate thousands of fake but convincing transaction records, specifically to show investigators. In part, it was because the SEC never checked the most basic thing they could have checked: his actual stock holdings on file with the Depository Trust Company, the organization that records all real securities transactions in the United States. Madoff later said, and this is chilling, "They never even looked at my stock records. If you're looking at a Ponzi scheme, it's the first thing you do." There was another near miss in the early 1990s. The SEC had investigated a pair of investment firms, Avellino and Bienes, that were funneling client money to Madoff. When that inquiry began, Madoff panicked, knowing investigators would want to compare records. The discrepancies between the fake statements Madoff had on file and the fake statements those firms had on file were significant. But somehow, inexplicably, the SEC's investigation never widened to fully expose Madoff's underlying operation. He had survived again. And life was very, very good. Bernie Madoff owned 4 homes, including a Manhattan penthouse and a Palm Beach estate. He maintained 3 yachts. He paid the staff who helped him run the scheme extraordinary salaries. Salaries that bought them houses, cars, and a lifestyle they had every financial incentive to protect with their silence. The scheme, by some estimates, had been running in one form or another since the early 1960s. Billions of dollars were flowing in. And for the thousands of investors, celebrities like Kevin Bacon, Steven Spielberg, and Larry King, foundations and charities, pension funds holding retirees' life savings, their statements kept looking better and better, right up until they didn't. 2008. The global financial crisis arrives like a tidal wave. Banks collapse. Lehman Brothers disappears overnight. The stock market loses nearly half its value. Panic spreads through every sector of the financial world. And somehow, impossibly, Bernie Madoff's fund is still reporting steady monthly gains of about 1%. But his investors aren't stupid. Even if their accounts look fine on paper, they're scared. And when scared people have money somewhere, they want it back. All at once, withdrawal requests pour in. An estimated $7 billion in requested withdrawals in just a matter of weeks. The problem is brutally simple. On paper, Madoff's fund held roughly $65 billion in client accounts. In reality, there was approximately $300 million left in his Chase bank account. He was about $64.5 billion short. He called investors. He begged associates. He tried desperately to find a lifeline. Nobody came. On December 9, 2008, Bernie Madoff called his sons, Mark and Andrew, both senior employees at the legitimate side of the firm, and told them he wanted to pay out bonuses to staff 2 months early. Mark and Andrew were confused. They confronted him. How could the firm pay bonuses when it was struggling to meet client withdrawals? That's when they went to his apartment. That's when Ruth Madoff stepped out of the room. And that's when Bernie told them everything. The investment fund was a lie. It had always been a lie. It was, in his own words, basically a giant Ponzi scheme. The next morning, his sons called their lawyer. Their lawyer called federal authorities. On December 11, 2008, FBI agents arrived at Bernie Madoff's apartment. He did not resist. He did not run. He was arrested on a single count of securities fraud. There's one more detail from those final days that tells you everything about the man Bernie Madoff had become. On Christmas Eve 2008, with his world closing in, his name becoming synonymous with betrayal, knowing what was coming for him and his family, Bernie and his wife Ruth reportedly took pills in what appeared to be a suicide attempt. They survived. On March 12, 2009, Bernard Lawrence Madoff stood before a federal judge and pleaded guilty to 11 federal felony counts, including securities fraud, wire fraud, investment advisor fraud, money laundering, and perjury. He did not cooperate with investigators. He insisted, to the end, that he had acted alone. Legal experts widely speculate this was to protect associates and family members from prosecution. Federal Judge Denny Chin did not buy the notion that leniency was warranted. On June 29, 2009, he sentenced Bernie Madoff to 150 years in federal prison, the maximum allowed. In his remarks, Judge Chin called the fraud extraordinarily evil. Madoff was sent to the Federal Correctional Complex in Butner, North Carolina. His staff did not escape unscathed. 5 former Madoff employees were ultimately convicted and sentenced to between 2.5 and 10 years in prison. His brother, Peter, the firm's chief compliance officer, received 10 years. His accountant, David Freeling, who had rubber-stamped fraudulent filings for years, cooperated with prosecutors and received 1 year of home detention. Madoff's son, Mark, the one who had first called the FBI, died by suicide on December 11, 2010, exactly 2 years after his father's arrest. His other son, Andrew, died of cancer in September 2014. Neither lived to see any closure. As for Bernie, he died on April 14, 2021, at the age of 82, at the Federal Medical Center in Butner, North Carolina. He had been suffering from terminal kidney failure. His request for compassionate release had been denied in 2020. Federal prosecutors noted at the time that his crime was unprecedented in scope and magnitude. He died behind bars. The numbers are staggering. More than 40,000 investors across 136 countries were affected. Estimated losses range from $17 to $18 billion in actual cash invested, though the fraudulent paper value of accounts, counting the fake profits Madoff had been reporting for decades, reached roughly $65 billion. The victims weren't only the ultra-wealthy. Charitable foundations that funded hospitals and scholarships lost everything. Pension funds representing the retirement savings of ordinary workers were gutted. Individual families who had invested their entire life savings lost it all, overnight. 2 investors took their own lives after the collapse. The case also exposed catastrophic failures at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Despite 8 formal warnings from Harry Markopolos over nearly a decade, the SEC failed to catch a crime that, as Madoff himself admitted, they could have detected with a single phone call to the right office. Congressional investigations followed. Reform efforts were launched. The SEC overhauled its whistleblower program, and today, that program has returned billions of dollars to fraud victims nationwide. Harry Markopolos, the analyst who never stopped trying to stop Madoff, was recognized by Congress. His book, No One Would Listen, became a bestseller. On the recovery side, court-appointed trustee Irving Picard spent years pursuing Madoff-linked assets, eventually recovering approximately $14.5 billion, roughly 70% of what investors had actually deposited. It was a remarkable legal effort, but for thousands of victims, it came too late to repair the damage. Madoff's name has since become a cultural shorthand for Wall Street greed and institutional failure. A Netflix documentary series, a book by Diana Henriquez titled The Wizard of Lies, a stage production, films and fictional works inspired by his story. He became, in a sense, America's financial bogeyman, proof that a respectable face and a prestigious address are no guarantee of anything. Here's what stays with you about Bernie Madoff, long after you've learned all the facts. He didn't need to do it. His legitimate brokerage firm was genuinely successful. He was already wealthy. He had already helped build the technology that powered modern electronic trading. He had already chaired the NASDAQ. By any rational measure, Bernie Madoff was a man who had made it. And yet, something in him couldn't stop. couldn't be satisfied, couldn't walk away from the power of being the man everyone wanted to trust. Thousands of people handed Bernie Madoff their retirement savings, their children's college funds, their charities, their futures, because he seemed like the kind of man you could trust with everything. And he took it all. Not out of desperation, out of choice. He died in a federal prison hospital, 82 years old, surrounded not by the luxury he'd spent decades accumulating, but by the consequences of every decision he had ever made. The Ponzi scheme Carlos Ponzi invented in 1920 lasted about 8 months before it collapsed. Bernie Madoff ran his for 6 decades. And the question that haunts this story, the question that keeps investigators and regulators and ordinary people up at night, isn't how he did it. It's how many people told the truth and nobody listened. Join the Crime Chronicles community and dive into the darkest mysteries from around the world. Like, share, subscribe, and comment your thoughts. We love hearing your theories.